Yes, welcome to the WiLD conversation and this series on adaptive performance and this in this space where participants are contributors and also where we take some of these concepts 2 steps deeper and 3 steps wider. And I'm grateful for everyone who's a part of this conversation. So last week we talked about entrepreneurial thinking and some of the research from Sarah Sarasvati, a scientist and great thinker that I was introduced to years ago. And Sarah's work really changed the way that we think about the way that entrepreneurs think. And I hope that some of you had a chance who were on last week's conversation had a chance to think more deeply about who you are and what you're about, and also who you know and what things you have at your fingertips and what might you be able to do with that, or else to spread the word to some other folks and affect them through that kind of thinking. So this week it's all about adaptive performance, as you know. And the one thing that was really cool is, so I did my graduate work, or some of my graduate work, down at Claremont Graduate University, and Peter Drucker, who's now passed away, was down at Claremont when I was there. And I don't think I fully understood how brilliant Peter was. There are certain things that I'm just gonna read an example in one of his books. I just gotta say, like, getting into this adaptive performance topic, I've been digging into a lot of books because there's a lot of thinking around not just like how does adaptive performance differ from things like agility or dealing with uncertainty. And so some of you are familiar with the book Switch, and it's interesting how to change things when change is hard. Peter Drucker's work in the space of innovation and entrepreneurship. And I want to talk about the fact that innovation is not the same as adaptation. So we're going to talk about that too. Peter Drucker's work is interesting, his work on nonprofits. We may spend a whole week at some point just talking about Drucker's focus there. It is not boring. There's some interesting stuff in there. Another friend of mine named Bob Thomas, who wrote a book called What Machines Can't Do. And it's interesting how he gets into even this concept of adaptivity. And then there's another book, The Paradox Principles. And then finally, Age of Paradox. And we might talk about that a different week. But there's so many things places I want to go. And then lastly, just to show you that mad scientist part of me, this is the Handbook of Industrial Organizational Psychology. So we're actually going to pull from this a little bit today. So one thing that Drucker says, and by the way, go back if you've been sort of a Drucker fan in the past, go back and read some more. The guy was brilliant. This last week, I just was getting back into his writing and some of the things. It's just some really powerful lessons for today, and what Drucker was talking about so long ago. This book I'm going to read just a quick quote from 1973 is interesting. But I'm actually going to read something, and if you were there, it's a good thing he's passed away because I think he'd probably tear me apart and probably do it in a very smart way that I wouldn't even know it was happening. But he said something in here that I think that is different today. I'm not saying he's wrong, but I might be saying he's wrong. So, the quote is this. He says, management has to work out what the task is, what the objectives are, what the standards are. Again, the doers should be used as a source of information. So the people who are actually going to perform the task, but the job is management's. So think about that. Management has to work out what the task is. And so Drucker was, and I'm just continuing to reread a lot of the books I have. I have stacks of his books, but I think his focus in a more traditional sense was really on management, defining what performance looks like. And so that's something that's important to hold. And I don't think he's wrong, but he's only partially right. And because that's an important distinction I'll talk to you about in just a moment. But I also want to point out that something we may spend another week on, especially if some of you relate to this. I know that there are many folks, taking part in this conversation or listening in who would see yourselves, you are in an organization where you're either considered a nonprofit or you're inside of an organization where your function serves the organization, but it's not necessarily revenue generating. I know that's not all of you, but it's some of you. And all of you, even if you do work, if you're a CEO and you're in a revenue generating space or role, you have functions inside of your organization that are more serving the organization as opposed to generating revenue. And it's interesting because Peter Drucker would say that those two functions are very similar, not-for-profit and service inside the organization, inside of a business or a revenue-generating organization. So there's a lot of similarities that we would break into. But here's the reason why I bring that up is that when it comes to performance, this is one of the most elusive things to study. And anyone that says it's simple or says, these are the metrics and these are the predictors, is probably trying to sell you something, because it is elusive. It is difficult to get to the true, like the measure of ROI, return on investment, or actually get to that we agree on what we're talking about. So we have to be very careful how we talk about this, and I'll try to be thoughtful about that as well. But I think one of the things that's interesting is to think about the level of performance. So Peter Drucker wrote a lot in the space of organizational performance. And he talked, and this would be a topic for a different week, but this is my transition into individual performance, is that on the, when it comes to at the organizational level, there's two things to think about. Is like in some cases there's a value, or there's a sort of we actually could measure the outcome. So if it's a business, whether or not we have the revenue that we need to function. So that value is generated as that outcome. If you're in your service part of an organization, Drucker would say that your outcome is actually your budget, which is another interesting conversation. But I want to disconnect that from what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to talk about individual level adaptive performance, which certainly plays into that larger cultural thing and the context within which you are functioning in your organization. But we're going to talk about individual level performance. And so that requires me to define that. So let me tell you classically how that handbook over there that I showed you just a minute ago defines it. And there are two traditional ways that performance has been thought about or measured, and so I think both hold those things together at the individual level, and it does translate to group level also. The first one that's most we see it easily is task performance. Task performance. Now here's what's interesting about that. These are behaviors. They're behaviors that are assigned, typically. So as Drucker said, this would be management's job to figure out what are the tasks we need done. And to go a little bit deeper, these are pre-coded behaviors that serve the technical core. In other words, they serve the core of our organization's mission. But they're designed, and so if someone comes into a job, and we know this is important, if you put together a job description, or what you think of your own job description, is these are things that you are assigned, typically through the organization, that support the technical core. That's what they do. Okay, so those are task-related behaviors. And when we interview people, we're interested, do you have the ability to fulfill those task behaviors? And so that's one piece. There's a second level, and it's called contextual performance. So task performance, contextual performance. These are still behaviors, but they're behaviors that are not assigned, but still support the environment around the technical core that the technical core needs to survive. And so it includes things like there's interpersonal pieces of this that are really important, and it's the behaviors around the technical core. Now, what's interesting is in a lot of job descriptions, traditionally, we have not included contextual kinds of performance variables. And so that's not what we're talking about yet, but it's closer. And so those contextual factors, they exist outside of that kind of the functional part of what we do, because those would be task-related behaviors. This is getting a little bit more muddy, because these are the things we look for that are a little bit more difficult to identify in a job interview, but they're still important. So we've got contextual performance, and then inside that you've got task performance. So here's where it gets super interesting, is this concept of adaptive performance, which is an emerging concept in the field of industrial organizational psychology, and it's something that we see is tremendously relevant today. One thing I want to separate is because I think people that know me know that I think words matter, and imagine that, words matter. And one of the things that matters about this is that adaptivity is different from innovation. Do you hear me? They might be related, but the concept of innovation and even entrepreneurial thinking, like we talked about last week, that's different from adaptation, because a highly adaptive person might be able to adapt into a non-innovative or an innovative kind of need or context. So just that's interesting, right? It's like, we're not talking about just throwing innovation, entrepreneurial thinking, pivoting, all these words that we throw out there. These are different kinds of things. We're talking about adaptive performance. So let me Let me describe this to you. It's kind of interesting. So this is about the best definition I could find. I couldn't even find one, but what I looked at is how people talk about it. And it's adaptive performance is, like I said, it's not agility, which, because it would be, the performance is what's different about this. It's not innovation, it's adaptation. And it's just defined, as best as I could find, as versatility and tolerance for ambiguity in addition to whatever tasks they involve. Listen to that. Versatility and tolerance for ambiguity in addition to whatever tasks they involve. So this is something that certainly, it's almost like this meta foundation underneath contextual and task performance, because it means that you could step into different kinds of situations and actually be able to adapt to what the need is. But it means that you're now fully responsible for identifying the need. And so it's that ability. And it doesn't mean that everyone's going to be super high on it. And it's interesting to think about that. So let's take this one step deeper. Because if at the organization level, we're talking about like achieving and these outcomes or deserving, it's interesting because this is about, when it comes to task and contextual performance, those are behaviors. Adaptive performance is not about behaving, it's about being. Okay, just bear with me. It's not about behaving, it's about being. And there's certainly going to be correlations between those two, but that's different. It's about being. And what they describe in the research around this is that it is made up of certain dispositions. Okay, so that's why the being part is important. It would relate to behaviors, but it's how I'm showing up. And what's also interesting is that we talked about composure under pressure for a few weeks. And so if you want to go back and look at some of those things on that whole process of leading under pressure and adversity that we went through about 8 or 9 weeks of, those are antecedents. So that's the how to become adaptive. We did some work on that, but I want to describe specifically adaptive performance now. And here are the dispositions. Just listen to this. Interesting. Even as you think about yourself and your own leadership in your work or in your family, or you think about the people that you're working with, these are those dispositions. One is what's called behavioral flexibility. And it's also that is also defined as is my capacity to take my lessons from the past and apply them. So it's not just like being flexible, but it's literally like an intentional saying, here's what I've learned in the past and how can I apply that? So that's the first thing, is what's called behavioral flexibility, or that applying lessons from the past. The second thing, get this, emotional stability, emotional regulation. And those of you who've been a part of the WiLD conversation and have been contributing or listening in, you know what I'm talking about. Like, emotional regulation is what we spent 8 weeks on. It's that ability to stand in the midst of the storm well. And then the strategies were the things that we talked about and I wrote about in my book about composure that allow a person to do that. So that's a key component of what it means to be adaptive, to perform adaptively. And then the third thing, so you've got ability to apply lessons from the past, or behavioral flexibility, whatever terms you like. You've got emotional stability or emotional regulation, standing well in the storm. And then it's what's called situational or contextual awareness. We do work with leaders in Hyderabad, India every year. And I asked a very senior leader at one point, I said, what is the number one, the most important competence of a leader in India today? And this leader said, he said, the ability to read context quickly. And it's really this third component, is this ability to read what needs to happen and be able to do that quickly, and then to be what's necessary in that moment. So and you look at those, that's why I focus these things. These things are about being as much as they are about behaving. It's about being aware. There's actually something also that we'll probably talk about in future weeks that's called metacognition. And it's a very high level, executive level of functioning and competence. And metacognition is quite literally thinking about your thinking. So it's an awareness at that level. And so one of these metacognitions would be to be able to look at a situation and say, what is appropriate here? In India, they'll say, like, there's so many different languages. You'll walk from village to village to village, and people will speak different languages. Like 1 mile down the road, they'll eat different food. And so can a leader step into that and understand the context and what's appropriate there? So that's what it's about. I know it's a lot to dig into, but I want to give you a quick metaphor for this. And so is another way to think about this that I just love. And so this gives me a chance to do something I haven't had a chance to do before. And I brought my toolbox. So this is it's not just a great, it's a great toolbox, you know, it's just designed well. But what I want to focus on is I want to talk about those 3 levels of performance. So at the first level, as I'm unpacking this toolbox, traditional toolbox, you know, in all ways. And as I unpack this, what I put in this toolbox is if someone were to buy a home today for the first time, what would they need? And I just thought, yeah, that's an important question. I've had a couple of houses. And so if someone is a first-time buyer, here's some tools you got to have. There's other things, but here's some important things. Some of you are already imagining what's in here. You got to have a good hammer, right? I mean, everybody's got to have a good hammer. So a hammer is certainly a part of that. Who doesn't need a 30-foot long tape measure? You know, these are, by the way, what I'm focused on right now, I hope you're making, these are tasks. These are task-related tools, right? These are important things. You gotta have a level. Who does? Whoa, hey! You gotta have a chair that the toolbox sits on. You gotta have a good level. Part of things. You gotta have a multi-tool on some level. Some of you are taking notes right now. This may be the most important part of the conversation this morning. This is the little known. You also need a really good pry bar. This is the thing that many of you are like, I gotta get a pry bar now. So this is just a general pry bar, but it's amazing how often you will use this bad boy. You need it. And also, so everyone needs a good stud finder. So if some of you were here in person, I'd be like, oh, boo, boo, boo. Well, there it is, stud finder. So you got that. That's the task part. You got to have those tools are assigned different tasks. Here's the deal. The toolbox in many ways represents that second kind of performance, that contextual performance. This is what surrounds those tools. And the toolbox is what carries those tools and allows that technical core to function well, is that. But here's what we're talking about today. This will blow your mind. I hope it blows your mind. Just take a look at this. Now, this is the biggest wrench, or at least crescent wrench I had ever seen. This thing is like, I don't know how long it is, but I put it along my arm, and it's like as long as my arm. And I bought this because I was I'm in the hardware store. I see this, and I was like, it's 15 bucks. I'm like, I have to buy that wrench. I mean, it's just looking at it is awesome. And I kid you not, when I bought it, I'm walking out of the store. 3 different people said this to me. They go, cool wrench. It was like, even the person at the checkout stand was like, cool wrench. Which aisle did you find that in? None of us we don't even know what we would use this for. But I bought it because of this. I would give this award to a member of my team every year. I'd give a certain award for people that actually perform the tasks. So it's like that's what was the toolbox. They get the toolbox and the tools. That's the contextual and task. I would give this to the person on the team that the team would choose, that because that person showed up, everything was better. And it was a different kind of award because it was about being, it was about presence, and it was about those 3 levels of performance. And so if you will go with me for this moment, is like thinking about your own wrenchness. I don't know if that's not even a word, but thinking about those 3 levels that we talked about: contextual awareness, ability to apply lessons from past experiences, and emotional self-regulation are these key parts of what it means to be adaptive as a performer. And it's a different kind of way of thinking about performance. And so I'm excited for you to continue your WiLD conversation now. And this whole conversation on whole and intentional leader development specifically related to adaptive performance.